set the mics. It's great to be with you. I first want to thank you all for everything that you do in our community. This is a great organization. All of you in this room are the heartbeat of our city. And it takes a lot of people to volunteer, to work and uphold a community and to make what actually creates community around us and for other people. And so that's what I think Rotary always does. And the people who are part of Rotary are always kind of the heartbeat of our community. It's great to see Southern law students here. I call those recruits. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do in my office, since Tripp's already kind of told you some of the first part of what I was going to tell you, which was a little bit about my background and how I ultimately ended up where I am now. So I'll kind of start there. I mean, I taught at the law school actually for across about 12 years. I taught legal writing and appellate advocacy and professional practice program. I worked also, I was working on my LLM at that time. I was volunteering after Hurricane Katrina, raising kids, just somebody who likes to stay busy. So I kept myself busy doing lots of things. And there was a lot going on to keep me busy with 4 boys. And, so that took up a lot of my time. I clerked in federal court after I got out of law school for Judge Frank Polizzola, who I'm sure many of you in this room knew. He was a great, great man to work for. He revered the law. He had such great respect for the rule of law. A lot of lawyers were scared to be in front of him, and I did see him make one cry at the podium, but, he just had such a great respect for the job that he performed in it and the rule of law in our communities and what that means to us and in terms of avoiding chaos and anarchy and all of the things that happen when you don't operate by the rule of law. And then I clerked for Judge Melvin Shortis for 3 years in the First Circuit Court of Appeal. I had an opportunity to go to the Fifth Circuit and do a 2-year clerkship with Judge Politz, who was then the chief judge of the Fifth Circuit, and I turned that down to stay in Baton Rouge, get married to my husband John, and we stayed here, and I clerked in the state court of appeal instead of going to that federal job. It was a great, great experience. Another great judge. Many of you, I'm sure, knew Judge Shortis. Judge Polizzola. They're very different people. And Judge Polizzola would always, if he was making a reservation for lunch, he would always say, "This is for Judge Frank J. Polizzola." Melvin Shortis would always say, "My name is Melvin." He was just a very humble person. He never really, told people that he was a judge. We ran together for years at the law school, and that's really how I met him, was through running and just a running crowd group that we had at the law school. And he invited me to come and work for him. And I took that opportunity, and it really ended up serving me enormously well. The 12 years that I taught and the 3 years that I spent in the state court of appeal and the 2 years that I spent in federal court all kind of coalesced when I came back from my fellowship to a job that I was chosen for as soon as I got back, and that was deputy executive counsel to the governor. And I found that, executive counsel, and I saw Angelique's name tag here somewhere. I don't know if she's in here. She's the current executive counsel to the governor. I worked with her for a long time, probably 12 years before I came to the Attorney General's office. But being the executive counsel and deputy executive counsel to the governor is like being a professional legal fireman or woman, as the case may be. And so you have to be really quick on your feet. You have to be able to go find the answers to legal questions. Often the press is asking these questions, other people are asking these questions, and they're asking them of the governor. And so I'm not the one that's going to stand at the podium and answer that question, the governor is. And so he needs me to be right. And so it was a job that required you to have a high degree of confidence that your research and that your answer that you were giving him to stand up in front of hundreds of people or tell, everybody who was asking if it was to the press was right. And I found that all of the experience that I had accumulated prior to that, really sort of surprisingly to me at the time, came to make me really good at that job, that I happened to have a skill set that made me very good at that job and being able to find the answer and be right. And then I went from there to being executive counsel. more political, in that more political role, having to deal with the legislature a lot more, having to testify in the legislature a lot. BP oil spill happened during that time, and I spent, at least the first 3 or 4 months of the BP oil spill basically camping out at GOSEP, dealing with lots of issues that came up related to that. Also had a lot of interaction with our Attorney General, and it just brought me into contact a lot with the Attorney General's office. And I think that's probably when I would tell you it's the first time that I really started thinking about the office of the Attorney General. And what does it mean? And not just what did it mean then with the occupant or our prior occupants of the office, but what did I think it should be? What did I envision for the office? What were other people making their Attorney General's offices? And I believed, because I just had such a deep kind of foundation in teaching law, studying the law, giving advice about the law in a context of being, working inside government, especially, that I just kind of thought this is the most important job in all of state government. It's not just the most important job in all of state government, and to me it still is the most important job in all of state government, but we touch everything in state government and local government. So we issue something like 200 legal opinions a year to local government on anything. I mean, you name it. So, that legal writing training that you're getting right now about how to do a basic legal research memo, it's really important. We do that 200 times a year for local government, and it tells them the answer to a question that they're disputing, and it can avoid litigation for them. It can solve a dispute before it turns into litigation where they've got to pay legal fees and go fight it out in court. So it provides a good service, I think, to local government. We represent judges when they get sued through my risk litigation division, through special litigation. I sometimes represent the legislature when they get sued. I've been in recent litigation involving the legislative auditor, an auditee, and the legislature, and I had to tell everybody they were wrong. So, sometimes it's just you are the mediator or you're the moderator of a legal dispute among different operators in government. And that's an important role too. But I think that, the most important thing about it is, to me, being able to actually be and project a professional office. I go to court, I argue cases. I've argued 5 times in the United States Supreme Court. I was in the First Circuit this morning and I argued in court. So I don't just leave that to everybody else in the office. I also take cases when I think it's important for me to be the one standing at the podium, and I think it's important for the people who work for me to know that I will be in the trenches with them. I know that, Hiller does the same thing. So I have the head of my criminal division, Leon Canizero, does the same thing. Leon's in court with my prosecutors, and so he's always encouraging them. If they haven't tried a certain kind of issue or a certain kind of charge, he's behind them to encourage them and to help them and to catch them if they are slipping. And so he's there to help them push beyond their boundaries, right? I've said this before, that one of the reasons that I'm standing here today, it's one of the reasons that I ended up with a fellowship in the United States Supreme Court. It's probably, the reason for a lot of things that I ultimately did, but the reason is because I didn't let fear stop me. Because there were a lot of reasons that I could not try to do a lot of the things that I did do, like go to Washington, for example, for that fellowship. I had 4 children and a husband with a law practice. And I give him credit for my ability to do that, because his attitude and mine was, this is going to be awesome. It's going to, there's some logistics we got to work out. There were some serious logistics we had to kind of figure out. They all fell into place. My mom moved in with me for 9 months. She is a retired history professor from USL. And she basically retired so that she could move in with me and help me, meet the kids at the bus stop every day, so that I could be comfortable going into the district with my youngest son, who was going to daycare at the building where I worked. And so he rode with me They stayed, the other two stayed, and one of them stayed here with John. And, we had a great year. They came to D.C. a lot. I took the kids out every weekend to do something that we never would have been able to do if we didn't have that much time in Washington, D.C., and they look back on it as a singularly unique and great experience. It could have been very different for all of us, but it wasn't because of the attitude of my spouse and my family that supported me in doing that. They didn't all. My aunt, after I got the fellowship, said, well, it's wonderful for you. It's a disaster for your family. And I said, well, we don't think so. And we made it work, and it was another just kind of step, I guess, along the path that kind of has me here standing today as the Attorney General. But I'm very proud of the work that we do in our law school, in our law school, in our office, which can be a sort of a law school at times, but we have a number of different divisions, and I'm not sure everybody, I want to kind of walk through them quickly just because I think a lot of people don't really understand the scope of what we do. They may think that, we are the law enforcement officers. In fact, the DAs are the primary people that are responsible for enforcing criminal law in our state, but I do have a criminal division. I assist the DAs if they ask me. I offer assistance in a lot of in certain types of cases like death penalty litigation, which I've offered my support to all the district attorneys in that because we're all going to be experiencing the same kinds of things. And then I take recusals from the district attorneys. When they have a conflict of interest, they usually hand those cases off to me. And that means that I have cases pending in every parish in the state. I am surprised every time I get an update memo from my criminal director on how often and how many places they are around the state of Louisiana. They're in almost every courtroom in the state during the course of the year. In motions, on trials, dealing with plea deals, plea arrangements. In New Orleans, when I came in, I picked up an agreement that Governor Landry, then Attorney General Landry, had kind of worked out with the district attorney in New Orleans for us to kind of split some duties that the governor intended, he had won already, so he knew he was going to be handing this off to me, and that he was going into the governor's office where he would be able to supply some state troopers to New Orleans and help them bring their crime rate down. At the time, Baton Rouge's crime rate was pretty high too. Shreveport's was very high, but New Orleans was kind of extraordinary. I didn't go to New Orleans without some degree of fear that I might be carjacked on Poydras, just going to my office. And so, because that was happening. And so, they had kind of an acute problem that we needed to address. And we entered into this agreement where Jeff was going to send about 50 or 60 new state troopers down there to have more boots on the ground, law enforcement presence, working with the New Orleans Police Department, and I would take any cases from any arrests that they made, and Jason would continue to take all of the cases that came out of the New Orleans Police Department arrests. That allowed us to be able to provide more law enforcement presence and enforcement without burdening the district attorney with a flood of new cases, and it's worked out very, very well. Jason, embraced it. We have worked really well in that process, and it's helped us to try and address some other systemic problems like the juvenile courts and things like that, why we have electronic ankle monitors that aren't being monitored and things like that. It teases out some of those other problems and allows us to attack them as a team and to start unraveling who all needs to be part of the solution. And that's really how I approach it. I love being in court. I love to argue cases. Litigation is very time-consuming, expensive, and not the best way to solve problems. That will always be true. So it's always going to be better if we can find other solutions to those problems. And that's why I'll always be somebody who wants to bring everybody in the room and say, let's start working on solutions. And sometimes when you do that, you figure out where the real obstacles are or who the real obstacles are, because they're obstructing solutions instead of being part of figuring out how we get there. Now, there may be times where the solution is not within their reach or within their purview, And that's okay. I mean, that's part of the conversation is, well, we have this obstacle because, this isn't my power. It's not my authority. I can't do this. Somebody else needs to do this. But you can work through those problems and figure out how to get to the next level and the next step in solving those problems. The Civil Division of my office does a lot of work. The Civil Division defends all of the challenges to the constitutional challenges to laws in our state. I've probably got 200 of those pending. They're not all active. Sometimes we let the lawyers, the outside counsel in the case handle those challenges. Sometimes it's private litigation where the challenge bubbles up that way, and we'll still monitor it and let those lawyers handle defending it. And sometimes it's big enough or it's important enough to us that we come in, we intervene, we file briefs in the case. We got involved in the look-back window litigation that was involving the Catholic Church, and that was a case that was in the Louisiana Supreme Court, and the court had issued an opinion that basically said that those claims were prescribed, the look-back window couldn't extend. We actually, it was a constitutional case decision. We actually filed a motion for rehearing with the court, managed to get the court to grant it, which is a pretty big lift all by itself, and then reverse themselves. And that's really hard. But they came back and they upheld the statute, and those cases are moving forward. And so it gave those victims some hope again. That they might actually get some justice for what had been done to them. And I think that that's right and that that's fair. The Federalism Division is a new division in my office. Jeff created it while he was there to kind of house the Office of the Solicitor General and focus on federal litigation that we're involved in as a state. If you've ever heard me talk about consent decrees, you know that I am not a fan. I think that, in federal litigation, consent decrees always end up being a lot more expensive and lasting a lot longer, and they become a huge problem for agencies. They shift power away from the people who were elected and appointed to handle certain problems and to run agencies, and they shift all of that into a federal court. And it changes everything. I think, Barbara, you could tell that it starts driving budgeting decisions, it drives legislative agendas. It's not the way that separation of powers is supposed to work for any extended period of time. And so if it's necessary to have federal court involvement with a state agency or a local government or something like that, or a police department or a prison, it should be for a minimal amount of time, and then the federal government should go back to doing its business, and we should go back to minding the business of the state. Because what we want is to drive better leadership, better solutions, solve those problems. It should come from our elected officials, really. It should not have to come from orders from a federal court. But the longer that stays in place, the more it perverts the whole structure of government and balance of power between the state and the federal government, the state and the local governments, and that includes the operation of our agencies. So that's what the Federalism Department has been involved in, a lot of those kinds of issues. I also was involved in challenging, and my Solicitor General now, Ben Aguinaga, who is the second LSU law graduate to ever clerk in the United States Supreme Court. I'm very proud of him. He clerked for Justice Alito, and he is now our state Solicitor General. And he is enormously talented, and I was able to turn over the reins of a division that I built from the ground up. I was the first Solicitor General. I had nobody. And I ended up with, probably 6 or 8 people who all punched, way above their pay grades. But and then when Ben came in, we kind of had to rebuild because a lot of those folks had been working for me for 6 years or 8 years, and they decided to kind of move on. So we had to rebuild. We have a very talented group of people who are very busy, and they are just really, really good writers and very smart people. And so I'm lucky to have them, and I'm grateful that I was able to turn my baby over to somebody who cares about it as much as I do and believes that it is as important of an operation in our office as I do. We have investigators. I have a whole division called the Louisiana Bureau of Investigation. We have statewide criminal jurisdiction to investigate crime anywhere in the state. Usually what happens when I investigate a case and have a case file, We will work with local police force, but we have arrest powers, we can arrest people, but then I have to turn it to the district attorney for prosecution. And sometimes they'll hand those cases back to me, sometimes they take those cases and prosecute them, and sometimes we do them together. We have a public protection division that does a lot of work defending consumer claims. You can make consumer complaints to that division. Whenever there's a hurricane, I'm usually out in the news promoting the anti-gouging law, price gouging law, and talking about where you can file complaints in our office. During the Super Bowl and during Taylor Swift and all of that, I was doing some promotional stuff showing how you could file complaints if you were seeing ticket scams and things like that. And so that's where those complaints go. They also do a lot of litigation out of my office related to recoveries that are related to pharmaceutical antitrust cases. So we've had a large number of those dating back all the way to when Buddy Caldwell was Attorney General, all through Jeff's tenure, and I still have a lot of those cases. And they deal with the way drugs are priced and how we pay for them, and some of the claims that we have related to improper pricing schemes. We have a gaming division, and we regulate gaming. So within the gaming division, we also provide legal advice to the commissions that regulate gaming. We're the lawyers for them. We are not the regulators of them, but we are the lawyers for the regulators and for those commissions, and that includes the Racing Commission. So, a lot of stuff going on in our office all the time. So what you hear on the news is usually only, the tip of the iceberg, and it's not always the correct tip of the iceberg either. But I have reached, and I've tried to establish a good working relationship with the press so that if they haven't gotten it right, I want them to get it right. I really do. I want the public to at least get factual information that is factually correct. And so that means that I need to tell them if they got it wrong, and then then they need to fix it if they got it wrong. And I think that makes us both better. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have. I don't know if my time is up, but all right, we got one.
Mona Scott, Southern University Law.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, yes, thank you. What was your role specifically as it relates to the terrorist attack in New Orleans for New Year's?
So good question. Mostly a backup role. I came in the day that it happened. Within a couple of hours of learning about the attack, I was in New Orleans and working with our federal partners, the governor, GOSEP, providing legal support to all of those groups. Some of the first questions that came up were, are we going to have a football game? When are we going to have a football game? We had to make some pretty quick decisions. I think the answer to that question to me was actually fairly easy. Yes, there was going to be a football game, and that football game was going to occur when we had the investigation complete enough and the area secured enough to bring people back in and have a football game. And so to me, that you back into the question of the timing by figuring out what do we need to do, and then we'll figure out how much time we need to do it, and then we can have a football game. I have continued an investigation into some of the facts that led up to that day. The FBI is in charge of the actual investigation, so I'm not responsible for investigating the terrorist who conducted the attack. I am looking at some other things that are they're more operational with regard to the city of New Orleans, certain decisions that kind of placed us in that position. Could we have done things differently? I think the answer to that question is 100% yes. We were doing things differently by the next day. So, by the same day, we were doing things differently. So, but, hindsight is always 20/20. And so I don't want to kind of, I'm not going to be the person who, and I wasn't the person who came out and started pointing a lot of fingers at everybody and trying to cast blame. I think that what we really need to do is look at all of the things that led to that day and see whether we need to or should, or now, because now that it's happened, we need to do things differently. So maybe it was okay the way we were doing things before, and maybe those decisions made sense at the time, but they don't anymore. And so I think we just have to be willing to kind of look at what happened, do a real after-action analysis of that event, and be willing to make the changes that are necessary. And, you know, the problem is with all of these, it could be a hurricane, it could be an oil spill, it can be a terrorist attack. It usually doesn't happen the exact same way twice. So even when we prepare for hurricanes, we do a lot of things. We drill for this. We do a lot of the same stuff, and we're good at it. We're really good at responding to hurricanes. But you know what? No storm is ever the same. And so that's part of our planning process, is going into it with the understanding and the expectation that we can't treat it like it's going to be the same. Because the minute you start doing that, you're not on your game anymore. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you articulate your vision of freedom of speech and freedom of expression?
Yeah, so I'm a huge defender of freedom of speech. You know, if we have all afternoon, we could have another conversation about LSU and tenure, but that's different. And I will say that's different, and I have pointed out, you know, without talking straight about the merits of the case, I have pointed out that a dispute between, you know, an employee of government or higher ed and their rights associated with their employment relationship, whether it's tenure rights or civil service rights or anything else, that is different from your rights as an individual citizen and your protections under the First Amendment through, you know, of freedom of speech. You know, I came to law school having been a journalist, you know, having a degree in journalism, having worked at a newspaper for a couple of years. I have defended freedom of speech against government action, even when I served in a government capacity. I think that that's important, and that we should be able to kind of look at some of these actions and be fair arbiters of what the rule of law is and what the outcome should be. And then we should let the process play out. You know, so I'm a big defender of freedom of speech. I will always be a big defender of freedom of speech and of the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Clark Dunbar, Manchester Sports, NFL Flag Football League.
Ah.
So, yeah, so you kind of know what my question
Uh-huh.
is. So, being a woman who you overcame so much in being the first to do things, what advice would you give to young ladies who are now going to be tasked with being the first and possibly the only in a field that is predominantly men? And so, just how do you suggest they overcome those Goliaths?
That's not the question I thought you'd ask me. I thought you were going to ask me about NIL deals. But I'll talk about that in a minute, too. Yeah, no, I will say, I think the answer to that is, and I say this because it's been my experience, and it may not be everybody's experience. So, you know, it's fair if you have a different experience. But I would say focus on building your skills. Be the best lawyer you can be. What I always did, I did not aspire to be the Attorney General. I aspired to be a really good legal writer. I aspired to be a really good lawyer. I aspired to be good at my job. And so that meant that I focused on my weaknesses and tried to build those into strengths and just get better individually and personally. I didn't focus on what everybody else was doing. I focused on me and how I could be better at my job and look for jobs that would move me to the next level in my career and in my skill base. Being a lawyer it takes a long time, you know? It's like being the Velveteen Rabbit. It takes a long time to be good at it. And there are people who have basic talent. They may be talented writers. They may be talented oral advocates. They may be, you know, really good negotiators. But, you know, at some point, you've got to do all of those things. You may not be good at all of those things, and you certainly aren't good at them, I can tell you, right when you get out of law school. Nobody knows how to do anything when you get out of law school. And so what you have to do is go work and start learning how to do things. You have to learn how to find the judge's office in the courthouse. You have to learn how to file pleadings in the courthouse. I mean, so I think you just have to get down to the business of doing it and focus on being good at it and figuring out what your weaknesses are and how to turn those into strengths. And then I also want to tell you about NIL, since I'm the only Attorney General in the country that's doing it. I do have an outreach program. It's an anti-vaping program where I came in and had some money from a settlement that was limited to talking to youth about vaping and the dangers of vaping. And we had been putting billboards up and doing some PSAs that I just didn't really think reached our youth. And so I restructured the entire program. I now have a team of people, including student athletes. I have about 100 of them who I contracted with through NIL contracts, which is really not that different from me hiring them like student workers, but for them, they have to do NIL. And so they are actually going out and talking directly to sixth graders with my outreach team and with the materials that I've developed to talk to them about vaping and about anxiety management and stuff like that. And so I'm very proud of that program. So I've got about 100 of them. Yeah. So I think my time's up. Thank y'all for having me.